Where did the Langmesser and the Bauernwehr appear from? And was it all Turkery? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So a little bit of context first before we dive into this question, which may or may not have an answer, and maybe you'll be part of making that answer, doing some research. Right, so first of all, what are these two things? Well, I think most people watching this channel probably know, but for those of you who don't, very quickly. So this is an example of a Langmesser. Okay, now the Langmesser is a sword which, the time is very important, so pay attention to this, which really appears around the year 1400 and becomes very popular in the 15th century, stays around throughout the 16th century, and in fact even into the 17th century in other forms. So the thing which really defines this and makes this different to a falchion, for example, we'll talk about the blade in a second, is the construction and style of the hilt, defined by a wooden hilt which may or may not have a through tang, but very often has rivets that go through the side here. And it doesn't have the traditional sort of grip where you have a guard, a grip and a pommel necessarily. They can have pommels, we'll come back to that in a second. But fundamentally it has a knife-like grip. As I say, very often with rivets through, although sometimes the rivets are decorational and sometimes they're peened at the end. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a second. And the other factor which really defines this is this nagel or nail at the side here, which is a complicated thing that's not easy to explain. We'll come back to that as well. Now, before we dive into it, the blade. So the blade was actually nothing new. In fact, we can find Langmesser like blades. They can be straight, they can be single-edged, they can be double-edged, they can be single-edged with a false edge, they can be curved, they can have a clipped point, a dropped point, a spear point. They can have all different types of blade on them. So actually the blade isn't really a defining feature of the Langmesser. Okay, some people might argue if it's got two edges then it's not a Langmesser, but we do find some which have very extended back edges. Okay, now the person who's done the most research on single-edged swords in the medieval period, or at least has published the most, is my friend James Elmsley. So Elmsley's typology. Now in Elmsley's typology we can see blades that you in the 15th century find on Langmesser. You can find those sorts of blades already in existence on falchions or even sort of single-edged chopper type things, even going all the way back to things like the Morgan Bible, where we see these sorts of choppers, one-handed and two-handed variants, being used in the 13th century. So in the 13th century we see falchions and choppers. In the 14th century we also see falchions and choppers, but we particularly start to see falchion blades with blades that we would later in the 15th century see exactly on Langmessers. But don't for a second think that the falchion disappeared and was replaced by the Langmesser. The Langmesser is something which is not entirely limited to, but certainly most popular in, loosely I want to call this, Germanic lands. Obviously Germany as such didn't quite exist yet, although culturally it did, the area where people spoke German. So what in the modern world would be Germany, Austria, perhaps a bit of Hungary, a bit of Poland, what's now Czechia, and Switzerland. Okay, so this sort of sphere around here, largely that sort of bit of the Holy Roman Empire plus a bit more. Okay, now you do in fact find these in other areas as well. You do find some examples, I would argue, and I can show evidence for this, but I won't go into it in this video, in England and indeed in France. And obviously France has a long border with the Germanic area anyway, so there is a region there where obviously there was a certain amount of Germanic influence as well. So without going into colossal depth, a Langmesser is essentially a falchion-like blade of various sorts, married to a knife type hilt. Ignore the guard, the guard's not really important to this. This has got a bit of a knuckle bow, but most of them just have a simple cross guard or a reversed S guard. Right, so a knife-like hilt. Now, therefore, some people I've spoken to are under the impression that, well, the Langmesser is just an evolution of the Bauernwehr. The problem is the Bauernwehr doesn't seem to date as early as the Langmesser. It actually seems to me like it's the other way around. It actually seems, and Bauernwehr incidentally just means peasant or farmer's knife, or defense as some people translate it. So these are commonly, they're sometimes referred to as a rugger, but we can just call it a peasant knife, okay? Not to say that they were only carried by peasants, there were high status ones, middle class ones and everything else. Right, so this incidentally is a Todd Cutler one. Now you'll notice it is essentially like a miniature Langmesser. It has the knife type grip, it has the nagel on the side, and it doesn't really matter what kind of blade it has. Some of them have got long pointy blades. Some of them like this have got more sort of almost falchion-esque blades. Not really important. And these were carried also, not just, as I say, they were sometimes carried by high status people as everyday side knives, hunting knives, so on and so forth. But it does seem like, in terms of certainly their popularity, the Langmesser was popular earlier on, and the rugger or bandwehr comes along really in the later 15th century and is really popular in the 16th century. Whereas we can start to see the Langmesser appearing already in the early 15th century. So here's the headline question, with some conjecture on my part based on some research so far, and there's a lot more to do. So where did they appear from? It's kind of weird, isn't it? Why did these swords suddenly appear and suddenly get popular in the 15th century? What was happening at that time that might possibly have inspired these swords? Well, you may well know that I don't just research medieval Europe. I'm also interested in many other periods of history, but also areas outside what's commonly considered Europe today. Now, there were certain groups of people from outside Europe, outside what we commonly consider Europe these days, who very much were having very impactful inputs onto European history at this time. Many people, in fact. I'll mention a few. There were the Mamluks, there were the Ottomans, there were the Tartars, okay, so various groups of people. Now, something that's interesting is when we look at the swords associated with those people, there's certain styles of hilt construction which may possibly have led to this. Okay, now I'm not saying that a Langmesser is necessarily based on an Ottoman sword or based on a Mamluk sword or based on a Tartar sword. What did those look like, incidentally, for those of you who don't know? Because I do understand a lot of people that watch this channel might know a lot about European arms and armour, but not necessarily North African, Middle Eastern, Asian, whatever. So, here we've got an LK Chen reproduction of a 14th century, bear in mind the Langmessers from the 15th century, a 14th century style of sword, commonly, in fact this is one found in China, but they're very, very similar, commonly associated with the Tartars, who obviously are a later sort of descriptive group of Mongols, what will commonly be known as Mongols, and obviously under Genghis Khan, there was a massive Mongol invasion in the 13th century, and then in the 14th century, there were a series of other Tartar attacks under people like Batu Khan and things like that on the outskirts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. Now, you have to remember, where did the Langmesser primarily appear? Let's loosely call it Germany. Okay, so to the east of Germany, obviously, we've got what's now Poland. But you've got a lot of Tartars in that area. You come down to Austro-Hungary, you've got both Tartar and Ottoman influence, shall we say. In fact, some of the biggest guns used by the Ottomans to bring down Constantinople were designed by Hungarian gunners, of course. And then if you come down to southern Europe and we look at the south of France and we look at Spain, you've got contact with the Mamluks. And certain Europeans were taken prisoner by the Mamluks, and indeed what's essentially now would be classed as Egypt, and ended up fighting in Mamluk armies. And so the Europeans had at various points fought either against or sometimes with Mamluks, the Sultanate around Alexandria. That's why we end up with the Alexandrian swords. We've also got lots of interesting things going on down in Sicily, and then over, if we go to obviously the Byzantine Empire, you've got all sorts of people mixing there, and then on the eastern frontier, in places what's now Poland, and on the sort of eastern front of the Holy Roman Empire, you've got the Tartars and people like that as well. So they were commonly using swords which had a hilt construction somewhat like this. Now there is, of course, variation. A Mamluk sword is not, let's say a Mamluk sword of the year 1400 is not exactly the same as an Ottoman sword of the year 1400, or indeed a Tartar sword of the year 1400. But they are somewhat related and have some common ancestry of design, and moreover they're quite different to European swords which go before that. We even see some of the details on the Langmesser, for example the shapes of the end of the pommels or the pommel caps on them, and some should we call them Eastern swords, to have some similarity as well. And moreover, the length, the fact that the Langmesser has a strangely long grip. And yet, this is also a feature we see on, for example, Chinese and Tartar or Mongol swords, but additionally even on Ottoman swords as well. Some quite famous examples. So even down to the proportions of the hilt and the length of that grip, which is unusually long by European standards, again might point to some inspiration for the Langmesser being from Eastern or Southern in some cases swords. So it's entirely possible that something like the Langmesser was at least partially inspired by, let's loosely call them, Oriental Eastern swords that were in contact with the outskirts, the edges of European Christendom, if we call it that for now. But here's another piece of evidence which might throw into the mix. When we look at European art of the 15th century, when they want to represent exotic foreign peoples, be they Tartars, be they Ottomans, be they North Africans, they often show them in their hands they are holding falchions or Langmesser. So it does seem that even in the world, even in the medieval mindset world, if you were an artist, if you were, you know, let's say mid-15th century Burgundian artist and you were making a manuscript and you were told to represent something involving people from the Middle East or people from North Africa or people from the East, could even be China in some cases, and you wanted to represent some exotic armour on them and some exotic weapons, but you only know what certain weapons look like, what they often put in their hands was a falchion or a Langmesser, which does suggest that in their minds at the time they somehow associated these swords with something that was foreign and exotic, and that's where we come to the term Turkery. Now, most people when they talk about Turkery, they are referring to the adoption of Ottoman Turkish fashion mostly, sometimes influences on jewellery and architecture and indeed weapons, and bringing it in, not in a positive or negative way, just because they thought, well, that's cool, that's a new design, bringing it in to the European sphere. And we see this hugely in all aspects of design and art, and indeed, of course, into weapons. Now, this period is commonly regarded as mostly covering the 16th to 18th century, but you know what? It started in the 15th century. So the period when these swords start to appear is exactly the period where Ottoman Turkish, for example, fashion and styles started to definitely, categorically and unquestionably play a role on European tastes and fashion choices. Everything from hats to shoes to you know, buildings, all sorts of stuff. So maybe there's some relation there. And there's another piece of evidence. If we look to Italy, so in Italy they didn't really adopt what we would commonly call the Langmesser. They had something called the storta. Now what's really interesting is the storta that we find in Italy in the 15th century, but particularly also in the 16th and 17th centuries, often have exotic foreign motifs on the decoration of the hilt and sometimes also on the blade. So much so that sometimes we have classical or exotic foreign heads carved onto the pommels and other motifs onto the guard and things like this. So there is this idea that even on the sword, which to us we might call a falchion, it's an Italian storta, so we think of it as Italian, but to them in the time, they think, wow, this is a really cool exotic sword, so I'm going to have exotic foreign motifs on the hilt. So it's not necessarily that they're categorically or explicitly copying a Turkish or Saracen or whatever sword, but in their mind, that's a type of sword which has at least a large part of its inspiration from outside of their direct cultural influence. So what do you think? Do you think I'm onto something here? I'm certainly not the first person to state this, but as far as I know, certainly on YouTube anyway, I'm probably the person that's championed this cause, explanation, perhaps more than anyone else that I'm aware of. And I think it's something we really need to research, because the fundamental question, whatever your views are, whatever your opinions are, that these weapons, the Langmesser and the Bauernwehr, which become incredibly common in the 15th century and carry on right the way through the 16th century, kind of seem like they come a bit from nowhere in terms of this particular combination of features. And also, finally, I have to also admit that there is one element which is literally staring us in the face, the Nagel, which I don't have an explanation for. We know the physical advantages of having a Nagel. It means that if a blade comes onto the flat of the blade and slides down here, it doesn't hit you in the knuckles, it stops on the Nagel. And there are certain techniques which actually use that explicitly. If we come to the Bauernwehr, which doesn't really have a crossguard, it's a good way of stopping the hand sliding up on the blade for safety, so it provides a bit of protection, but it also stops the hand from coming onto the blade if you're using it as a stabbing implement. So it has a practical use. We all understand that. We can see the treatises and it explains how to use them. We don't really know where it comes from. And I have looked through lots of non-European swords because of my theory about where the idea for Langmessers may have come from. And I can't find anything outside of Europe really that would explain that. But equally, I can't find anything within Europe that would explain it as well. They sort of come from nowhere. So do you have any ideas about that? Maybe it stems from some earlier form of smaller projection. There are certain types of 14th century dagger, quillon dagger, which possibly have little projections on the side, so maybe it comes from that. But anyway, what do you think about my theory? Do you think that Turkery, as it's sometimes referred to, obviously the Ottoman Empire was on the rise and on the expansion, particularly at the end of the 14th century and into the 15th century, most famously culminating in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. So this is the exact period when the Langmesser is on the rise, is the period when the Ottomans, from a European perspective, are also on the rise as a power. But equally, the Mamluks have been incredibly powerful in the 14th century, and of course the Tartars have been a big problem as well from a European perspective. So, do you think it's plausible that the Langmesser, at least within the European mind, was partially inspired by external world swords? And which ones do you think particularly played a part? And can you think of any explanation in terms of where it came from for that Nagel? Anyway, something to think about, something a little bit different. I don't claim to have all the answers, but sometimes I look at all the data and I can see patterns, and that's what I'm trying to present here. I hope this has been interesting. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton, and of course, I will be again next time as well. Take care, folks.